Hey, y'all. I know what you're thinking. Oh my God, not another podcast. And I agree. I'm typically that person that doesn't listen to podcasts either. But my name is Will Johnson, and I'm here to bring something a little different for you. This is the At-homish podcast, creating spaces where we belong. Welcome back to the At-homish podcast, or welcome for the first time if you haven't checked this out. And if you haven't checked this out, why? This is great. This is good stuff here. But we're now at episode 9, and I have my third guest with me today, which I'm so excited about, Senator Marko Liias. Could you please take a moment to introduce yourself?
Yes. So good to be with you. And I feel like especially fortunate because I'm staring out these big, beautiful windows at a sunny Snohomish day. So I feel like I've been transported to summer, or at least it looks like summer outside. I'm Marko Liias. I'm a state senator from South Snohomish County. So I represent Edmonds, Linwood, Mukilteo, parts of South Everett, a lifelong Snohomish County resident, lifelong Washingtonian. I also teach. I also work for the Snohomish County Executive Office, where I get to work on Office of Social Justice topics with them as well. So kind of all sorts of fun experiences in the community and getting to look at some of these issues from a lot of different perspectives.
Awesome. Thank you for sharing that. And I'm so glad to have you here today. And, we were just saying before we started recording that this came up pretty quickly for us to be able to make this happen because, like, you tend to get out in the community a lot. And we were at the NAACP Gala on Saturday night. And when I saw you, we just had a real brief conversation. But then I asked you if you were interested and you accepted. I was like, yes. But I didn't know it would happen so quickly.
Well, it's like my predecessor would talk about something. He said there's nothing as powerful as an idea whose time has come. And so, it was our moment. And I'm like a lot of Washingtonians headed to get some sun here soon. So I was like, I either got to do this now or it's going to be a little later. So why not now?
Exactly. And similar for me, we're on spring break right now with the school district. And I was thinking to myself, after we spoke, I need to reach out to Trent and see if we can record this week. I don't know if I'll be able to schedule a guest or not. Maybe I end up doing something by myself, because we're at the mid-season right now. But then again, for it to work out, I thought that was perfect. So thank you so much for agreeing and being here today. I appreciate you.
Awesome. Happy to.
Yeah. So you're saying you teach at the UW?
I do. Well, a couple of years ago, I started teaching at the community college level. I taught American government, actually out at the East Campus of Everett Community College, although I think that during the pandemic that got shifted around, but it was really valuable experience. And then I have a friend who's a professor at the University of Washington, and we started team teaching some classes. And I just think it's so valuable to be, with students, not just because it's wonderful to be able to share my experience. My undergrad experience, I got to hear from a lot of practitioners, and I found that really valuable to hear like who are the people that are doing this stuff that can share their insights. But also, it's kind of a trite phrase, but I do really learn from my students so much, and watching how they make connections. Also, just the act of teaching helps me make connections in my own brain about how some of these topics either flow together or don't. And so I don't do a ton of it, usually every year, every other year, a class here or there, but it is really enriching.
Yeah, it's great to hear you say that, because even when I reflect on my teaching career, I felt similar in the sense of, yes, we have information that we are, picking up from a book or from our life experience that we're now sharing with the students. But it's so important that as we're working with students, that we're also hearing from them and really understanding how this information relates to their lives, how they're receiving it, and how they're able to apply it moving forward.
That inclusion is really important. When you're invited into a conversation and it has relevance and resonance with you, that's, I think, when our hearts and our minds are the most open to learning. And, we see that in our K through 12 schools. We see that in higher ed. We see that just like when you're doing training at work and you're doing training, in life, when you have a seat at the table, when you feel like they care about you and they're invested in you, you just show up differently.
Right. And, it's interesting to think back when you just mentioned inclusion, because I think in some places that's a trigger word for people.
Which, it's just sad that we're in this moment, right? Like, let's just go to first principles, like including. Right. What is so scary about including? Like, why is it scary to have people at the table with you. I mean, I grew up in a big, huge Finnish family. My parents are both immigrants, and every holiday would be about 30 of us crammed into a living room that really could fit about 8.
Mhm.
And there was, if there were 30 people, there were 32 conversations going on. And, just that having a lot of people at the table, whether it's a physical table or a spiritual table, I don't understand why it's so scary. The worst thing that's going to happen is you're going to learn something. You're going to see the world from a different perspective. And I don't know, in my book, that's okay.
Right. We get the opportunity to learn something, see something new. And then, when I think about just stress and anxiety, if someone is included and they feel seen, heard, and valued, they can be themselves and not have to worry about saying the wrong thing or being looked at negatively because we're accepting and supporting one another.
And I think, when you're in that relationship, when you're in that community, the secret is it's really not possible to say the wrong thing, because if you're in that space and you're listening to one another, even if the word doesn't strike you right, you can say, hey, you just said this and this is how I heard it. And is that how you meant it? What do you think about that? I'm learning so much about our English language all the time. And, the phrase grandfathering, we grandfather people in to programs and government all the time. Well, that has deep roots in who could vote and who couldn't vote in the, post-Civil War period. I had no idea. And I mean, the word grandfather doesn't tell you that, right? No. You need to have that context. The other one that I have heard recently is the phrase circle the wagons. People get really nervous about, and I looked it up, and it turns out like people have been circling wagons for thousands of years.
For sure.
And depending on your intentions, you may not be bringing ill intention. It might just be, hey, human history has been full of people circling up because there were wolves or there were who knows what it was out there that they were circling up against. So, we can learn from each other. And if the phrase doesn't bother me, but it bothers you, then let's figure out a way to communicate differently and better.
Well, even when I think back to in a previous district, we were working on restorative circles, and they were saying the power of the circle is that you can't see what's behind you, but I can. And so if we're circling up, we have this space where there's safety, we're connected. Even going back to Knights of the Round Table, there's no head of the table. And so the circle plays an important role in how we show up in relationships and support one another.
Yeah, it's so true.
Yeah,
it's also, to get super sappy and romantic, right? Like it doesn't have an end, right? Like a circle, when you think about that, exactly a ring, there is something powerful in that. At the NAACP gala, they had us hold hands for the invocation. And it's been a minute since I held hands with strangers in a room, but, and I was a little resistant in my heart, I will say, when they said it, like, I don't know. I mean, the people that were sitting next to me were fine people, but I'm like, I don't know. And the moment I did it, it was sort of electric. You feel that literal connection with people. And I don't know, we got to remind ourselves that it's okay to get out of our comfort zones occasionally.
So. For sure. And of course, in the prayer that he delivered was just pretty powerful.
Oh my gosh. Ooh. Yeah. And I'm not especially religious myself.
Same here.
Yeah. But he did a good job of speaking to people that faith connection's important, but also speaking to folks who, maybe that's not the way that we articulate and communicate. And Reverend Ben's is a dear friend, so I was not surprised, but I told him I usually see him in the advocacy space. I don't usually see him as a minister. And it was really, I appreciated seeing my friend in a different light. And, he just brings so much honesty and earnestness to what he does and integrity that is really cool.
Yeah, it is great when we get to see different facets of someone's identity that we may not typically see. And, and we only really get that through inclusion and being welcoming and supportive. So, yeah, it was great. But you mentioned something about coming to the table. And I was at an event last night, my first one. I went to the iftar. They had the iftar that was held at the Carnegie Building here in At-homish. And not going to lie, I think back, I was in the Army, probably 20 years old or so. And I went to the Soldier of the Month board. And one of the questions was, what's Ramadan? What is Ramadan? And I looked at the people asking the question and it was like, Sergeant, I do not know that answer at this time, but I will get back to you as soon as I can. And I went and looked it up. I'm like, oh, well, why? This was in the early 90s. I'm like, why are they asking me about Ramadan? Like, what is this? What does this mean? And, of course, once I learned about it, it was like, oh, so this is very important to a large group of people in our
Yes.
world. But in that same vein, I had never been to any events connected to Ramadan. So last night, same day as Easter, the first time I attended a Ramadan event, and the thing about the table, the one of the guys that was speaking mentioned that we need to tear down the walls and use the materials to build tables. And this is where we can come and really have community, where we can come and break bread and be together.
That's such a beautiful metaphor. It's sort of like turning your swords into plowshares, same kind of imagery. I hadn't thought about turning walls into tables, but now I like it.
Oh, I love it. Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I think there is also something just at a very basic human level, the power of exchanging food and feeding one another. If you think about the hierarchy of our needs, like it's right there at the core of it. Like without food and water, we won't go very far. And so to exchange that, to me is such a beautiful, if you think about inclusion, you think about how do we draw sort of threads that unite all of us. Like there's, in my experience, not really a culture in the world where that exchange of food doesn't have some sort of, ceremony or power or, significance. And yeah, that's really beautiful. I have not had a chance to do an iftar, and I am embarrassed to say I have a wonderful Muslim colleague from Tacoma. And so now I'm like, I need to go pick up the phone and figure out maybe not this Ramadan, but in the future, when can we congregate for that? Cause that would be really special.
Yeah.
And who doesn't love homemade food?
Oh my gosh. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm here for it.
So you got me thinking about my great grandma now, Big Mama, and you go over to Big Mama's house, first thing she's going to do is offer you some food.
Yep. Yep. When I visit my family in Finland, every house you go to, you have coffee service. And so when I was a kid and I'd go with family, it's like, I can't drink coffee 8 times in a row. Like that's too much for me. But to say no is also hard. So yeah, it sometimes they can love you. They can over love you with the food, but that's a good problem to have too.
Did they have decaf? I'm curious.
Well, I was the weirdo and would get juice or tea after about the third cup because I was like, I can't have this much coffee.
Yeah,
so.
Yeah. Well, speaking of Finland, I remember that's actually how we first got connected. Years ago, there was an opportunity for a bunch of educators to go to Finland. And I was so excited because I had never been to Finland. And I had paid, part of my deposit, had reached out to you about different things that were going on, but even though the tour was totally structured. So it's not like I was going to be able to do things outside of that. And I made my final payment in February of 2020.
I forgot your timing was not great. So
yeah. And so still have not been to Finland.
Oh my goodness. Well, we definitely have to arrange a makeup opportunity because it's, especially we're headed. I mean, the summertime and in Finland is like the best time to be there. So we're headed into peak visiting time. But no, my parents both came from a small farming community on the coast. So farming and fishing were big.
Okay.
And, they just much different lives than we live here now in this busy urban metropolis. And my grandparents on my dad's side lived there their whole life. And I had a chance to go see them many times and like go sit on a farm, go sit in the forest, go. My grandfather in his retirement made his own handmade wooden boats. So we'd go float around on a boat that he'd made. It just was it helped me appreciate that not everybody lives the way that I do. Not everybody has the hustle and bustle and stress and noise and traffic and all of that. So I just have these deep, wonderful memories of kind of like just, enjoying life and watching the birds chirp in the trees and, listening to the tall grass sway in the breeze. It was good experiences that grounded me and helped me remember that my life is not the only life that is important, that there are other people out there doing all sorts of other stuff.
Yeah. Thank you so much for sharing that. Because, as you were talking about growing up in the, coastal community and farming, and I think about, my journey has been kind of the opposite, because I was born in the inner city, and then my mom moved us out into the suburbs, and we moved out further where we were passing some fields at some point, but I can't remember the first time I actually got to the coast, and so it was always about hustle and bustle. I had conversations with people about this with my life, to where it feels like I've been hustling and fighting to get to where you came from.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And it is, we have this conversation about privilege a lot, and who has privilege and what is privilege. And, I didn't realize that putting your bare toes in the water on the sand is a privilege, because that was just my growing up. I had a chance. My other grandparents, when they immigrated here, they actually ended up at the Oregon coast. So they were right there. And so I can't remember a time when I wasn't dipping my toes into a river or a lake or the ocean. And now I recognize, and now I understand that is not an opportunity that everybody gets, but it is a good, as we center, like, what is privilege? Sometimes the things that are privilege for others are just everyday life for you. And, we have to sort of be courageous and willing to sort of think about that, and know that there's nothing wrong with the fact that my grandparents took me to the beach. I shouldn't be ashamed or guilty or nervous about it. And then also, how do I make sure that if that's what other people want to experience, that they have that same joy and that same opportunity?
Yeah, if that's what they want. But this conversation here has me thinking back to a video I saw earlier today. It was like a reel on Instagram. And when I hear the word privilege, I know sometimes that can also be a trigger word for people. Yeah. But the video was a woman in Africa, and she's mentioning Africa as a continent, and she's standing in this forest and looking out over these mountains and talking about the beauty of Africa and everything that it has to offer. And so, when I think about privilege and it being a word that gets people, kind of riled up in this country, when I reflect on it, it has definite roots in race, culture, ethnicity, but then also on a global scope, it's our history that has presented the struggle when we talk about privilege. Does that make sense?
No, I hear that. And as you were talking, I was resonating with sort of, I grew up in a more religious family. My grandparents and my parents, people of deep faith, and they talk about blessings. And, there's sort of a similar root, right? The concept of privilege, the concept of blessing, both speaks to that. We are pleased and gratified to have this opportunity. And I think also a reflection that we didn't earn every element of it, right? When you're blessed, by definition, like somebody, whether it's a creator or somebody, has given you this opportunity. And I think that's what I take from privilege. Like, I have things in my life that I didn't necessarily on my own earn for myself. And then the question is, like, what are you going to do with it? Right. And what are you going to do with the knowledge? What are you going to do with that positionality? What are you going to do with that opportunity? So that, to me, it's not and I think there are folks who use the word as a way to harm others. And I think that also hurts, right? Like, I didn't choose what family to be born into. I didn't choose what gender or race or orientation. I didn't get to select a lot of these things. And so it's not about where you sit. It's about what you're going to do with it. I think, to me, that's what I hear when I hear about privilege. And I think there's that intention and that conversation that needs to take place.
Yeah, I get that, because I feel like even in my role, and I believe I've said it on episode before, I feel like I have positional privilege. Because being a director, serving on the superintendent's cabinet, I've often told people that when I walk into spaces, people who know who I am, they may act a certain way around me. Yeah. And I say, don't, I'm just, let's have the conversation, because I do want to hear your authentic voice. I want to know where you're coming from. I want to know what your needs and concerns are. I don't want it to be, smoke and mirrors, rainbows and unicorns. And then when I leave the space, it's like, oh yeah, this place is terrible. I don't have what I need. It's like, but like
you could have just told me that.
Right. I want to hear those hard things. But I think what I was wanting to get at through that video that I saw is that oftentimes when the term privilege comes up, and people automatically say race. And it's
Right.
like, it's not necessarily about race. It's about
Yeah.
our history and what has happened
Mhm.
to take this away from people. Because, there's parts of me that really wish that what was it like to be on the African continent before the 1400s?
Right.
And I mean, good, bad, and different, whatnot. But it's like people talk about some of the beaches in Africa and the rainforest, and I mean, all the different things that are
Yeah.
there. And it's like there are people living their lives that weren't impacted by the transatlantic slave trade, or not directly impacted
Right.
by it. And then that's where the term privilege tends to come up in our society of Western culture, and how, we have the have and have nots, and it's this society that we have.
Yeah, it's so true. And it's also just about, we talked about the powerful unifying force of food and culture, our background and our ancestors, whoever we are, we have ancestors that brought us to this point.
Right.
Right. And there are a lot of sad stories in that ancestry, but I think there's also joy and there's also love. And, it's about kind of how do you sort of stay in touch with all of those different channels of inspiration, those channels of history, and I think that's the other piece in this discussion of privilege that I hear resistance to is everybody's had struggle. And I think if we start to try and compare our struggles, that becomes really hard because anybody's struggle feels big to them.
Right.
And so to try and say my struggle is better or worse than or bigger or smaller, I want to know sort of why are we having that conversation? Like, what are we trying to learn from this? Because everybody brings pain and sorrow. That's what life gives us all on some level. And it's, how do we learn from that? How do we hear each other through that? And it is a good reminder that no matter what continent your ancestors are from or grew up or shepherded, they had pain, they had sorrow, they had happiness, they had joy, they had love, they had good food, they had times of want, and so how do we take those roots and sort of find a path to coexistence, find a path to work together? I don't know.
Yeah, finding a path for sure. And kind of even reflecting on what I was saying about my mom and the trajectory I was on, where, I was born in the inner city and I was like, here's that hustle, here's that grind. Hopefully I don't come off as dismissive sometimes, but I think sometimes people will come to me with this struggle or this challenge or this thing. And I'm like, okay, where we going with that? And it's like, I see you in the muck right now, and, you're going through whatever. And how can I now help you, or can I even help you to get to where you want to go? What resources do we need? What conversation is it? How do we move forward?
Yeah. And I think I also experience this like in my daily life with my partner and my family. Like I'm a problem solver. And so I want to be like, so what are we going to do about it? And, some people, they just need some time to take a breath and sit with it. They don't need a solution right away. Sometimes they need a hand to hold, a shoulder to lean on, maybe to cry into. And that's, I often have to sort of check myself and say, what do they need from me right now? Like, do they need a checklist of solutions, or do they need just somebody to listen and be with them in this moment as they process through what they're feeling? And I would say patience is probably, that is something I need to work on, is sort of the patience to, just sit and be with those feelings. And, that's important too. And that's part of that context. That's part of that culture too. How do we sort of process through these things?
Yeah, patience has definitely gotten me through. In my classroom, I wrote PEG on the board to start the year. They're like, who's PEG? I'm like, no, it's not a who. PEG is patience, empathy, and grace. And I don't know if you know this or not, but I taught in a high school behavior program. And I'm like, this is what gets us through the day, because we're all coming in with different wants, different needs, different places. And so we need to be patient with each other. My journey has not been your journey. And so I have to practice empathy to really understand where you're coming from, putting myself in your shoes. And I ask you to do the same, because, here you are as a student, I'm your teacher. I've prepared these lessons for you. I've studied, I've worked to be able to be in this role as your educator. And it doesn't come easy.
Yeah.
And if you can acknowledge that and understand where I'm coming from, perhaps you're not going to give the guest teacher a hard time when they come in,
Yeah. No, it's so true.
And then that final component of grace, just really knowing that we're not perfect. And so, okay, maybe we didn't have all our goals, but we're still going to have that pizza party on Friday.
Yeah.
And we're going to talk about what is it that we now need to do to continue to grow in who we are and how we show up for each other. Because if the rewards are consistently unavailable to us, we never get to have that.
Yeah.
We don't get to tip our toes in the water.
Yeah. Well, and grace is a two-way street,
Ooh,
right?
so
I mean,
much.
I think there are people out there who just want to receive grace, and you also need to grant some too,
Absolutely.
And especially with a class full of rowdy, rambunctious students, like
They weren't in my class.
I need some two-way grace here, I do think empathy, I mean, there's actually like some fascinating scholarship around kind of the brain development of people. And as you map the differences between the political parties and some of the ideologies in this country, like one of those sort of dividing lines is the ability of people to feel empathy. And and I don't know what the explanation is. I'm not smart enough yet in my journey to know, but I even see it, in the work that I do in politics. There are a lot of people who have a difficult time accessing that place of empathy unless they personally have experienced or witnessed or know somebody. And I think it is probably, it's my grandparents and my parents. And in particular, I think the faith traditions that they express to me that I am able to sort of put my mind even temporarily in the experiences of somebody else. And that's so powerful, that they're not the other, that you can sort of push through the veil a little bit. And I watched some of my colleagues really struggle with that. The opioid addiction wasn't real for them until it was somebody in their family. And it's a blessing to be able to witness other folks' experiences and draw lessons and inspiration from it, because not everybody gets to access that in the same way. And that's something to hold on to. And particularly for our students to teach that skill, that it doesn't need to be your literal brother or sister for them to be your brother or sister.
Right. Well, we're all brothers and sisters. Right?
Yeah. If we want to be, But
yeah, that's so interesting because, when I think about in schools, we talk about trauma-informed practices.
Yeah.
And I often have people coming up, and it seems like sometimes people may want a checklist or a manual of, well, how do I do this? What's the work I need to do? And the core of trauma-informed practices is that treat each person like they've been through it or they're going through it, And so how do we now show up with that grace, with that support to say, hey, I may not know what you're going through, and I'm here for you.
And we still got to learn some math and some science today.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
That's the real struggle is like, I see you're going through a lot, but we still got some stuff we got to do that's unrelated to that to keep going. And that's why the work that our educators do, hats off. I think it's so, we talk about education being the great equalizer, and it sounds so lovely until you have to be the person that's looking at those inequities and working through, people bring in all sorts of different experiences, and you got to bring them together and find a way to learn your letters today.
Right.
That's just really powerful.
But one of the things that really helped me out was, and I think we even talk about this when we get ready to start the year, it's like the learning's going to happen. It needs to happen. But spend the first week, 2 weeks building relationships, getting to know one another, setting the culture for your classroom, because in setting that culture and building those relationships, that's where we can now, that's a space where learning occurs. So even earlier, you mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And so if we don't have food, air, water, we're not trying to learn. But then the level above that talks about safety and security, sense of belonging, which is definitely a hot topic in schools right now. Then from sense of belonging, self-esteem, and then self-actualization. And so that self-esteem, self-actualization, that's really where that teaching and learning occurs. And I emphasize teaching and learning because if teachers are in a place where or educators aren't in a place where they feel secure in their roles, or that they have a voice, or that they belong, are they able to be effective educators for students who are in those same spaces?
Well, and at a high level, trying to learn how to learn, we're trying to learn how to think, and I couldn't tell you very much about my high school physics class anymore. I do remember that we had to roll a ball down an incline and land it in a cup on the ground. My group did it. I could not tell you today what the equations were and how we did it, and it was really the process of meeting this goal and figuring it out. That's what we learned in that class. Like I could go back and find those equations if I need them. I couldn't learn, that teamwork, that ability to meet a goal, that ability to come together and solve a problem. Like that's really the core of what we're there. And then, because we're going to live in a shared society with one another, like we got to learn how to, sit quietly when we got to sit quietly and speak up when we got to speak up. And like, there's just a lot of those skills that, are so critical. So you're right. I mean, as a policymaker, we're like, what are our math scores like? What are our reading scores like? And there aren't those same measures for like, how are our next generation of citizens like? Ooh. And, I think that we do need to think about that qualitative sort of aspect of education, that it isn't just about a number on a piece of paper. It's about, I don't know, a sense of values and a sense of belonging in our society that we're trying to impart too.
Yeah, absolutely. When we mentioned solving problems, I had to think back to one of the ways I got my kids to enjoy algebra. I just wrote on the board, algebra is life. And they're like, wait, what? I'm like, algebra is life. I'm like, check it out. Like, trust me on this one. So right now, here's where you are, okay? You're going through it, right? Right? You don't want to be in this space anymore, right? So that's over here on the other side of that equal sign. In the middle, there are these different operations and then this variable, and you just don't understand what that is right now. You're trying to solve for that variable. So now you've got to isolate the variable, get rid of all this muck over here, the coefficients, the operations, do the inverse operation to find out what that answer is. And they're like, oh, I'm like, so hey, algebra is life. We're just trying to figure out how to solve these problems and get to where we want to be.
So you have a second career as an algebra poet in you. An algebra artist.
Right, there we go. But well, on art, I used to do a lot of art when I was in school, but life has stopped me from doing that. With all the art in At-homish, I definitely want to get back into it. But I often tell people, like, well, I'm a cultural architect now.
I like that.
Working on creating those spaces where we belong.
It's so true. Yeah. Well, and I mean, in my work, I do a lot of budget work. I chair our transportation committee, and there are so many Excel spreadsheets of my life, and I don't thankfully have to make them all, but I have really great team that helps me. And I'm just often remembering that, like, the numbers in the boxes on the Excel spreadsheet are about like infrastructure that is impacting people's real lives and staying connected. I like to drive around and look at the stuff we're working on to the extent I can and get that connection. Because if all it is just numbers and rows, it becomes very easy to shift those. Well, we'll just put that number on that page and put it in that box instead. And you got to stay connected to the humanity and what that represents. And so a cultural architecture is real, right? When they built I-90 through Spokane and they destroyed the largest park that served the Black community and split the Black businesses from the Black residents, that infrastructure decision impacted the culture and the community even to this day there. And so it is powerful to think about kind of the form follows function, function follows form. How do that interrelate?
Wow, that's so powerful. But yeah, I think about, studying history, and you hope and wish, and well, I mean, we know in some cases it weren't, but that people have good intentions when they're making decisions, but then really understanding of how, some of the negative conditions that we currently have were designed that way.
Well, and, in the United States in 2024, so much of what is perpetuating the inequities that we're seeing around us is just baked in. And, that for me, particularly as a leader who is white, realizing how much these practices hide themselves from me, I think there are a lot of people with really good intention. It's just the air they breathe. It's the water they're swimming in, and they don't, the system is hiding itself from them. And that's where in the Bible, they talk about the scales falling from their eyes. Sometimes that's where I'm trying to do my work, is sort of, what am I not seeing that's around us? Because that's the real challenge. And that's a hard task, to find things that are trying to hide themselves. But that's the work. We're not going to make things better if we don't find the way that they're not working.
Absolutely. It makes me, I had somebody ask me a question about how do I set goals in my work? Because like you're saying, if things are hidden, it may be difficult to actually figure out what is the impact of this and where are we going? And so just like we mentioned, Maslow's hierarchy of needs on our district website, when I have our vision and framework lined out, I also have the connection to the Blackfoot hierarchy of needs. And the Blackfoot hierarchy of needs, where Maslow's hierarchy ends with self-actualization, the Blackfoot hierarchy begins with self-actualization. And so it's like, here you are showing up as a person with your needs fulfilled. The next level is community actualization. So it's like, how are we now showing up as a community for one another? Because we have our needs met, we're supporting one another. And then the final level is cultural perpetuity.
Wow.
Right. And so the first time I read that, it just really made me kind of take a deep breath, sit back in my seat and think, okay, is what we're doing as a society sustainable for everyone? And if it's not, what are the things that we need to do that can exist into perpetuity?
Yeah. I mean, I think that there's a profound tension there, because most of what we do in our daily lives, we won't even remember, let alone future generations. And I think we also have to make peace with that, right? We only get this one life. We only get this one set of experiences. And how do you balance, like, I need to draw the most value out of my experience here while also thinking about how we leave it better than you found it.
Yeah.
It set the next generation off on a better footing. I also love our indigenous tribes here in Washington talked about the seventh generation.
Yes.
And thinking about how will these impact the seventh generation. And just a couple of years ago, we were sitting I think it was in the Senate, maybe it was in the House for the state of the state. And an indigenous minister was giving the invocation. And they pointed out that if you go back to the statehood of Washington, we are the seventh generation. And you think about, kind of candidly, how far afield we've gone on some things. And it is powerful to look back across 7 generations and say, what did they do that left us with salmon that are dying off and orchid that are dying off? And how do we make sure that it doesn't take us 7 generations from now to dig out of that? How do we sort of try and bend the curve of history? But yeah, that thinking downstream, thinking down through history, it's heavy.
Yeah.
Cause I just want to figure out what I'm going to have for dinner tonight and, what movie I'm going to watch, and thinking about 7 generations from now, that's hard. That's heavy.
Well, of course, you put me right in that mindset, because with Washington becoming a state, late 1800s, post Civil War. So it's like, ooh,
yeah,
that's a lot to reflect on.
Yeah. And I mean, like everybody, our story is so imperfect. I mean, our first state constitution said Chinese Americans that weren't born here could not own property. Like if they had money and were ready to sign the papers, they could not. They were excluded from land ownership, and not to mention, the very, very dark history with our indigenous folks, the boarding schools and others. So it is history. It has happened. And we have to sort of take notice of it and sit with that sometimes.
So, of course, one of the themes of this podcast is creating spaces where we belong. How does belonging show up in your life and work?
It's really, like everything, kind of an evolving journey for me. I mean, I think of sort of how I thought about belonging when I started my work in particular in the legislature 16 years ago. Like belonging was very different, and what it meant was very different, and who I was very different. And how do I think about it today? And, I think that's the journey our society's on, is who does belong in the conversation. And, 16 years ago, I wasn't thinking about who's not at the table. I was thinking about who is at the table. And that's been, for me, I think, one of the big evolutions in my own thinking is sort of looking around. I had a wonderful colleague, Mona Doss. She was senator from Kent area. And we served on a committee together, and we were hearing a huge, really important climate policy. And the hearing room we were in was packed, literally not an empty seat in the hearing room, probably 150 people. And she turned to me and she said, "How many women of color do you see in the audience?" And I had never looked at an audience with that question in my head. And there were 3 in that room. And I have never looked at a room full of people the same way since. Once again, the scales fall from your eyes and you start to look differently, and you start to ask yourself, not who is here, but ask yourself who's not here.
Right.
That's been really powerful to me. And then it's not enough to say who's not here. Then, that begs the question of how do we find them? How do we get them in the room? How do we hear their voices? So I think that's, to me, where my head is at on sort of belonging in the work that I'm doing, is who's here, who's not here, who should be here, who needs to be here, and how do we get them?
Yeah, that's definitely so important in our work, because with the decisions that we make in our work, it's like who are our decisions impacting, and do they have a voice at the table? And then, even going deeper than that, are people able to share their authentic voice at the table? A conversation I was having with someone a couple of years back who was at the table, but then they were kind of mimicking the rest of the conversation that was going on. It's like, oh, you're just trying to reserve your space. You don't want to say that thing that you're really thinking, because you feel that, probably even accurate, that if you say that thing, you're not going to be welcome back at that table.
That is a challenge, right, of creating those spaces. And the table analogy of the table works, but it's also not perfect, right? Not everybody's ready to put on clean clothes and sit in one spot and listen and talk. And exactly, that's just not the way everybody shows up. And thinking about a theoretical table where people can show up in various ways. And the one beauty of, the pandemic was just sort of a parade of terribles. But one thing we were given as a gift in the legislature was using these new technologies to bring people's voices in different ways, because all of us were remote for a little bit of time. We all had to learn how to use the tools. And I was sitting in our Ways and Means Budget Committee. We had a bill in front of us that was about the education that folks receive while they're incarcerated and what kind of educational programs are available in our state institutions. And because of Zoom, we heard directly from a person in incarceration. They came to us via Zoom. And as they were testifying, I thought to myself, before this technology, there would have been zero way. There just would not have been a way to transport them safely and securely, and all the officers and all the hoop. But here, and how different it was. And then a few weeks later, I was in a higher education committee hearing. We're talking about what our students in community colleges are going through, the supports they need. And a student who was experiencing homelessness came to us from their car in the parking lot of the place they were staying and talked about their experience. And again, the likelihood that they would have come to Olympia at the right time to be in the right spot was really hard. But to hear those stories directly from the people that were most impacted and to have them at the quote unquote table with us was really powerful. And so it is true that not everybody's able to show up in exactly the way that we're ready to receive them. So how do we think about that question too? Like maybe they're ready to tell us their story. Maybe they're ready to contribute. How are we setting the space and creating an opportunity for that?
Wow, that's powerful.
Yeah.
Because I think about years ago, I was in church, and there was a sermon, but the reverend was talking about how folks showing up to church with their pants sagging, And it's like, well, you can't come in here with your pants sagging. And it's like, okay, but I'm coming in to hear the word and you're not going to let me in just because of the way that I'm dressed, you know? And so really thinking the way people show up as being a barrier for them to be in that space.
Yeah.
Well, I love that term though, the parade of terribles. I got a good vision on that of, oh yeah, there's another float. There's another one.
It's like when you think it couldn't get worse. Like that was the thing. You just stopped. You stopped saying that. You stopped saying, "Oh, it can't get worse," because every day it was like, "Oh no."
Yeah, reflecting on that. Yeah, never say it can't get any worse because you never know. So another theme that has come up in some of these conversations, and not necessarily the conversation here in the podcast, but in the community when I'm talking with people. There are some people who feel like, well, what do you mean there might be a place where I don't belong or I don't have a voice? Like I've never experienced that. And in one of my episodes, I kind of shared some stories from my life where I didn't necessarily feel welcome, safe, or that I belong. Is there anything that you've had happen in your life where you would say, maybe you didn't feel like you belong or you didn't feel supported or valued?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, I think for me, growing up as an LGBTQ person in an evangelical faith community, that family was from a really beautiful coastal community in Finland, but one that had some pretty rigid expectations about what was right and what was wrong. And for me, it was a lot of hiding to myself and certainly hiding to the world around me. I can remember I didn't come out until my mid-20s, just policing everything about myself so that, nobody would figure out this terrible secret that I was carrying with me. And it is, particularly because I was born into a tall, broad-shouldered white male body, I think I show up in a lot of spaces and people have expectations about who I am and what I'm bringing to the table. Like knowing and having that experience for 25 years of knowing that there was a lot of me that they couldn't see and that I wasn't sure I could bring to the conversation definitely helped me appreciate that internal dialogue that people are having. And also that we just really don't know so much about what people are bringing to the table, especially as we have deeper and better understandings of neurodiversity and ability. And, there's a lot of people that show up and it's our brain, right? Our brain needs to create some scheme of organizing. So we say, all right, Will looks like the other 1,000 people like Will I've met in my life. So I'm going to put him in that category for my self-sorting, but we really don't know what's beneath the surface so much. So that's been for me, if I felt that way, are there other people feeling that way? And then, just like you talked about being on the superintendent's cabinet and you show up in a space and you thinking about how people are experiencing that, I also feel like I have the great privilege of showing up as a tall, broad-shouldered white male and being able to jam the door open for somebody else to join that space too. And whether that's, our trans community and the trans youth that are facing so many threats, how can I use the pictures that people have in their head of me and the voice and the microphone or the megaphone that I have to help them hear voices that should be there? Because sometimes those folks aren't in the room or can't be in the room, or it's not safe for them to be in the room, but we can bring their voices with us.
Absolutely.
So I don't know. That's some meditations on that question.
That's awesome. Yeah, covered quite a bit there. But it's important that we be in the room or be an ally for someone if they can't be there. It's so important. As we're getting ready to wrap up here a little bit, some lighter questions, of course. Yeah. So what's been one of your greater challenges in your career, and what inspired you to get into politics? I'm curious about that.
I wish I knew the answer to that. What I do remember is in third grade, my cousin gave me a biography of President Kennedy, one of these kids biographies. And it just lit a fascination in me of how our government works, how our society works. I was the 4th and 5th grader that my mom had to set an egg timer for me to go play outside because I just wanted to come back and read books.
Oh, wow.
I was that kid. And it just always fascinated me. Something about it. I mean, I think particularly as I think about it as an adult now, the idea that we live in a country where people who are on the outside can be on the inside, that is an interesting, it doesn't happen all the time. And it is a little bit of a storybook story for many, but it also does happen. President Obama was elected president, even though it was very unlikely that a man whose name was Hussein at that moment in history would be there. It did happen. And, some amazing things have happened and a lot of things haven't, but some amazing things have happened. I think that inspired me. And then when I was in high school, I was our student representative to the school board. It was a new program. I was the second person from my high school that got to do it. And I learned that when I said stuff, people listened and they cared and that they sort of did something about it. And that sense that my voice, like the words that came out of my mouth could have impact on the community around me, it just supercharged me. And that is, my favorite part about my jobs in public life and public sector is being able to make the place I live, make the community around me better. And whether that's better education funding or a bridge that needs to be built or helping fund a pride celebration so that people in my community can come together and just be ourselves. That I think is what I connect with the most and what energizes me. It is really hard in this moment to navigate some of the challenges we're facing. The answers are not clear at all. And the clerk of the Senate will call my name and I have to say yes or no. And most of the time I want to say, I don't know, but I can't. I have to pick one. And that's a hard job. But at the end of it, to know that the reason I'm connected to this is to try and, make the place I live, the people that I live with, make our community a better and hopefully stronger and more resilient place. That's what keeps me going. And there's a lot of people in history that you can look to for inspiration that did
absolutely,
it.
Yeah.
And, how do I learn from them and hopefully try and hang on the hem of their legacy. So,
yeah, I do recall you mentioned being a student rep to the school board, because in my role, I'm a liaison for our student advisory council. We need to connect and talk some more on that. So, yeah.
I mean, it is, especially to those voices that feel like they don't matter, that opportunity to see concretely that their voice does matter and that it does change things. Like, you're setting people off on hopefully a lifetime of advocacy and engagement in one form or the other. It's so powerful.
Right. So, of course, with this being the At-homish podcast, got to ask the question, what is it that makes you feel most at home?
Well, I would say we got a puppy about 2 years ago.
Okay.
And I don't have kids. My partner and I got a puppy, and getting home and hearing him bark at me upon my arrival, but more importantly, snuggle up to me, and just having this creature who is just like, it is the highlight of their day when I show up in their space, and just that unconditional love. And just that is for me, and my partner brings a lot of that too, and my family. But there's something about that kind of unbridled joy and unconditional love every time I get home that I hope to give that to my family and to the people around me too. But that is probably the thing right now that most resonates. Like, I know as I'm pulling in the driveway, like, oh, it's gonna be good. It's always good when I get home.
That's awesome. Well, I have to say, I always enjoy when I see you in spaces. So, yes, I appreciate you and all
sweet.
you do.
Yes.
Yeah. So, thank you so much for sharing this time with us. Again, it's always a pleasure to talk with you. And the work you're doing down in Olympia, greatly appreciate you. I know our students do. And so, thank you so much.
Oh, this is so great.
Yeah. Couple of just highlights from the day. Just really thinking about, how do we create the space for people to show up? How do we work to tear down walls and build tables and create community? How are we going to be an ally for people, or just show up for folks? And then the big thing of practicing grace and having patience and empathy for those around us. And so if for our listeners out there, I hope this was a lot to take in. This was a good conversation. And so I hope you got something out of it. Hope you continue to tune in. Hope you grab some merch off the website. Because again, I love to see that out in the community. And please share this podcast with people. I can't tell you how many folks I've come across where they're like, dude, I listened to it and the message is so relevant and you're easy to listen to. I appreciate that. But then also even the concept of at-homish, it's like maybe you're not from a place, but it can feel like home when we show up for each other. So I'm going to wrap up like we typically do. Thank you again for joining us. And when we wise up, we rise up. Peace out.